Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's webinar for Chinese agents. 女士们、先生们、朋友们，大家好. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Rhett Miller, and I am the Trade Commissioner for Education for North Asia, normally based in Shanghai, but now currently in Melbourne, in Australia. I wanted to start today by expressing my sympathies to all of you who are enduring the ongoing crisis in China. Our thoughts are with you and your families in this difficult time. As many of you know, China is also my home at present, and having been there up until 3 weeks ago, I know and appreciate the disruption and difficulties to your daily life at the moment. We also know that the travel restrictions announced earlier this month have been hard on you, your families, your businesses, and of course, our Chinese students. These travel restrictions were put in place as part of a global effort to contain the virus, and we remain hopeful that when things improve in the future, we'll be able to welcome students back to Australia beyond the group of Year 11 and 12 students who have been exempted from the restrictions, according to criteria which you will hear about later. The Australian government continues to support agents through this difficult period by providing information on the Study in Australia website and government WeChat and Weibo channels. We are also supporting 9 upcoming agent virtual events by presenting an online version of the Study in Australia presentation, and we have already developed an Austrade market recovery plan for China when things improve. We want to continue to convey the sympathies of all Australians to those affected by the virus through our #InThisTogether campaign, which provides a way for messages of support to be sent to affected students and their families. So please share those messages as you receive them on our government Weibo and WeChat channels. But the purpose of today is really to give you an update on the current travel restrictions and the recently announced exemptions to those restrictions for Year 11 and 12 students meeting key criteria. And we are privileged today to have joining us 2 experts from the agencies responsible for these policies. Matt Noble, who is the Director of the Graduate Visa Section for the Department of Home Affairs, and Alison Cleary, who is the Director of the ESOS Policy and Legislation Unit within the International Division of the Department of Education, Skills and Employment. The agenda today will see Matt providing an overview of the travel restrictions, to be followed by Alison, who will give us an overview of the Year 11 and 12 exemptions, which should take around 35 minutes. We'll then finish with a Q&A session, which will go for a further 20 minutes. So without further ado, if I can turn over to Matt to begin today's webinar. Matt.
And everyone, thank you very much for your time. I'd just like to start just to echo Rhett's words there, and just to say from Home Affairs perspective, thank you for all the work that you do in a very important market that is China, and the support that you provide, no doubt, throughout the whole process. So I just wanted to echo those words. As Rhett mentioned, I'll just start on my first slide with just a review really of where we're at with the travel restrictions. You would all be quite aware of them, I'm sure. So if you can just move to the next slide. So just to quickly summarise those, so as you would all know, from 1st of February 2020, all travellers arriving from mainland China, regardless of nationality, are subject to enhanced border control measures because of the recent coronavirus outbreak. So what that means is that Australia would unfortunately have to deny entry to anyone who has left or transited mainland China within the previous 14 days. There are some exceptions to that. Australian citizens, permanent residents, New Zealand citizens resident in Australia, immediate family members of Australian citizens and permanent residents, and that includes spouses, minor dependents and legal guardians, and diplomats. So apart from the agreed exceptions, all other foreign nationals who are in mainland China will not be allowed to enter Australia until 14 days after they have left or transited through mainland China. So these enhanced public safety measures measures will apply to those seeking to enter Australia as well as those seeking to transit through Australia en route to another country. So of course, these measures are temporary, and as you would have noted from the 1st of February 2020, have been periodically reviewed by government. Move on to particular exemptions that were announced recently by government. So I'm sure, as you're all aware, Year 11 and 12 students who have remained in China due to Australian travel restrictions, apart from those in the Hubei province, have been offered a pathway to resume their studies in recognition of the importance of the final 2 years of school, and the exemptions will be considered on a case-by-case basis. But my colleague, Ali Cleary from Department of Education, Skills and Employment will no doubt provide a bit more information on this process. So I just wanted to outline, obviously, what we're seeing in terms of the impacts of the travel restrictions. So we very much understand that these restrictions have impacted many student visa holders. As you all know, China is an incredibly important market, and we very much welcome Chinese students to Australia, indeed, and the hundreds of thousands of international students each year. It's the largest source of tourists and students coming to Australia, with more than 1 million arrivals every year. So what we're trying to do is really do everything we can to assist travellers impacted, whether they're students in this case, or indeed other travellers, to know about the travel restrictions and of course comply with those measures, but also keeping things relatively open in terms of visa lodgement and approval, so such a time when travel restrictions are lifted, those students are able to come in as quickly as possible. I thought it'd be useful just to give you a bit of a snapshot of what we're seeing in terms of lodgement. So the lodgements of student visas from Chinese nationals outside of Australia was actually trending higher than in previous years in the lead up to Chinese New Year on the 25th of January 2020. So what we're seeing actually, though, is that the lodgement rate, because of course Chinese students and indeed other foreign nationals in mainland China continue to be able to lodge online. We've not seen a large change there, which I think is good news. So we've seen that from Chinese residents, a decrease of 0.7% in February compared to the same period in 2019. So I think that's a positive sign. Chinese students are still applying, and we certainly welcome that. I just wanted to point out in terms of some other impacts of travel restrictions, just maybe onto the next slide, if that's okay. Oh, sorry, just back one. Sorry, I think I've gone on. Yes. So just to have a look at some of the things that we've done there in terms of some of the work across government that has been obviously quite important, and I'm sure through providers you're aware of some of this. We've been working very closely with the Department of Education, Skills and Employment to share data. So what we've done is given student level visa data through to providers, and that was done very early on in the piece after travel restrictions had been applied, to give providers, and by association yourselves, the best possible information on the impacts on individual providers. So we continue to work closely with other parts of government in terms of data sharing. We all understand, how important data can be to assess impacts. There's been obviously a range of communication tools drafted that have been hopefully useful to you and prospective students, and indeed those students who remain in mainland China. These include fact sheets for education providers and student visa holders, And where we've tried to, where we can, we've made these fact sheets available in Chinese as well. So I know also some of our messaging has been sent via other channels. I know Rhett's played a great role there in distributing some of that material against with some networks that you might be familiar with. So we try and keep the website as updated as we can. So it really is the single source of truth for us. We're probably going to update the fact sheets again very soon, so please keep an eye on them on the relevant part on our website. Move to the next slide. I just wanted to also, like I said, we have still received a good amount of visa lodgements, which is great. We are continuing to process student visa applications from people residing in mainland China. Many of you will know that we some time ago actually centralized our processing function in Adelaide. So that remains business as usual, and where applicants are able to meet the criteria, visa approvals are continuing. I would just point out, which many of you would be aware, with some of the visa decision-making process, obviously, sometimes in the Chinese market, things such as health character and English language criteria are required to be met. And we're aware, of course, of localized closures, which may impact a student's ability to be able to meet that criteria. We're certainly taking that into consideration, just to give you that assurance that if those mandatory criterias, as they may be required for certain visa applications, cannot be met because of closures, etc., we understand that, and we will obviously hold the application until such a time as it's reasonable for a student to be able to give us that evidentiary requirements as may be relevant to their application. Just wanted to point out just a couple of points here, just around some generalized information around visa status and bridging visas that have come up in many conversations. I'll mention at the end of the presentation some of the work that's going to government on how we might be able to minimise impacts for students in mainland China, or indeed some of those students in Australia who have been somewhat impacted by the travel restrictions. But I just wanted to just start with just a few key messages around student visas. At the moment, as you'd all be aware, we obviously work in a fairly binding legislative framework. So there's no actual ability as it currently stands until different decisions made by government for student visas just to be extended. So at this point in time, if a student wishes to extend their stay in Australia, they'll need to lodge a new visa application. So whether that's a student visa, a visitor visa, or some other form of visa that they may be eligible for, and all the normal pathways of lodgement would apply there. So like I said, at this time, it's not possible for us to waive that legislative requirement pending any decisions from government to in a targeted way deal with any sort of consequences and impacts that students may have suffered from the travel restriction. So if a student requires additional time in Australia to complete their study, they only need to apply for a new student visa at least 6 weeks, but no more than 3 months prior to their existing student visa expiring. Just wanted to also mention bridging visas. We've had a few questions from agents and providers around the status of bridging visas. So unfortunately, bridging visas are unable to actually be extended, and they can't be extended for a student if they're outside of Australia. That particular type of bridging visa is a bridging visa B. Usually that's used when someone has an application valid, lodged on shore, and before it being finalised, they need to return home for whatever reason, and within the validity of that bridging visa B, they return to then continue Now, we understand that there will be some people who are overseas impacted by the travel restriction whose bridging visa may expire during that time. That's certainly a cohort that we're looking at as well when I mentioned that there's considerations with government around impacts. As it stands at the moment, if someone's bridging visa B were to expire, they would need to apply for another visa once travel restrictions have been lifted. So the particular example there is the subclass 485, which is the temporary graduate visa. So if they've been overseas, that can only be granted in Australia, so a student or indeed an applicant will need to find their way back to Australia. Again, it's in a package of possible things that we can look at pending government decision in terms of impacts. But as it stands at today, it will be a case of that person needing to apply for, say, a visitor visa to come in and recommence that application process. So on to the next slide. I just wanted to also mention that we're, of course, like I've said throughout, working very closely, both across government, particularly with Ali from education and her colleagues, and Rhett in Austrade. But indeed, you know, there's not many parts of government that aren't very focused on the impacts here. So very broad discussions around government. And, you know, I'm very pleased to say, I think on behalf of Home Affairs, we feel like we're all pulling in the same direction and are very aware of impacts and working to do what we can to minimize them, but also look at the inevitable sort of rebuild and rebound, both for students, yourselves, and providers. Together with that work across government, we've got a number of mechanisms that allow us to talk frequently and often with providers through their peak body apparatus, so the Education Visa Consultative Committee, Global Reputation Task Force, and other provider updates and communications, of course. So we're doing a lot of that activity, and hopefully you are all tapped into various parts of that communication. Like I said before, though, there are those more public-facing sources of information, such as our website, other government agency websites, Department of Health, Department of Education, of course. There's other key resources that I'm sure you're drawing upon and pointing any students to. Just wanted to also just again mention that we are really looking to government for some decisions around case-by-case concessions for applicants who have been affected by the travel restrictions. And really we're starting, you know, just to bring home that point, we're really starting from a principle where we wouldn't want any student to be disadvantaged moving forward as an impact of the travel restrictions. So I'll just finish up again just with a plug to some of those great sources of information that are updated frequently. In particular, our homeaffairs.gov.au website. Please stay tuned to that for messages both from right up from the travel restriction itself down to the particular impacts on students, and hopefully some more announcements as we move forward around the government response in the bit that Home Affairs is responsible for. So I'll leave it at that for now. I'm happy to probably take questions at the end during the Q&A segment after my colleague Ali has spoken to you about the particular measures that Department of Education are responsible for.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, for that extremely insightful presentation. Just for everybody's awareness, any announcements that come out from the Department of Home Affairs in relation to the travel restrictions are being broadcast out on Australian Government Weibo and WeChat channels in the market. And I know that you are signed up to those, including the Study in Australia channels. So please look out for those announcements going forward. Likewise, that Education Visa Consultative Committee, the EVCC, that Matt mentioned earlier is something that we feed back into regularly at Austrade. And I know Matt and his colleagues are always interested to hear perspectives from agents. So please, as you've done in the past, if you have feedback, provide it to our Austrade staff in the market, and they can make sure that it gets back to Matt and his colleagues. But without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce once again Alison Cleary, who's the Director of the ESOS Policy and Legislation Unit with the National Division of DESI, to give us some more information on the travel restriction exemptions for Year 11 and 12 students. Over to you, Alison.
Hello, can you hear me now? Hello? Look, thank you, Rhett. It's a really great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to so many agents today, and I appreciate the time that you've taken to join this presentation. And I'd like to join my colleagues in acknowledging the work not only of the Chinese government, but of the Chinese people in working through the COVID-19 virus situation. We know that it is impacting so much more on you than it is here in Australia, and we wanted to acknowledge the suffering, but also the efforts that are being made in order to contain the disease. As has been mentioned, Chinese students are an incredibly important part of the international student community in Australia, and we are working very hard across government to minimise the disruption to students' education and to find ways of continuing that education, but also to enable them to return to the Australian community and to take up their education once more. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk about some potential changes that we're hoping will affect some of the students who are most impacted by an interruption to their education, which is senior secondary students, those in years 11 and 12, who are obviously working in a very important time in their lives toward completing their school education. Can we have the next slide, please? So I just want to be clear about what we are talking about. It's a variation to those exemptions that a variation to the travel restrictions that Matthew referred to. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the mechanisms that are going to be used to enable senior secondary students to come into Australia. Basically, we're relying on a discretion that's available to the Australian Border Force Commissioner to enable him to allow students on a case-by-case basis to come into Australia using a discretionary power. And basically, applicants need to demonstrate compassionate and compelling reasons why they might be granted that exemption. And basically, Australian governments have come together and agreed that it's very important that students most impacted be able to continue their education. And we thought that was an ideal use of the ABS Commissioner's discretion to consider how we might assist those students. So there are criteria that do need to be met. And if we just go to the next slide, that'll show who's eligible to apply for this exemption. So it's students who are studying on a student visa or who want to come to Australia on a student visa. They need to have held that visa when the government made the announcement last Saturday about the new arrangements. They need to not be currently unwell nor have been unwell in the last 14 days. And we are not allowing students to travel directly from or via the Hubei province. They need to have a stable address for self-isolation. So when they arrive in Australia, they're going to need to have a place where they can stay safely and practice self-isolation practices. And they must be willing and able to meet those requirements, and plus any other state and territory requirements that those states and territories' health agencies may put in place. We have also allowed for one guardian per student if they already hold a guardian visa in respect of that student to travel with them to Australia. In terms of the process, this is a relatively complex arrangement that's having to be negotiated across many government agencies, both at the Commonwealth and the state and territory level. And in order to achieve agreement, we've had to allow each state and territory to make a determination whether they will take part or not. We have not received any indication that there will be jurisdictions that will not take place, but I need to be clear that there is the opportunity for a state or a territory to not take place in the process that I'm going to describe to you. The Australian Government Department of Education Skills Employment, where I work in the International Division, will be overseeing this process, and they'll be working with health and education authorities in the Commonwealth, but also the states and territories, in order to gather the information and evidence that students are going to need to allow the ABF Commissioner to exercise his discretion with regard to applications. So we have schools involved, we have state education and health authorities involved, and also the Australian Border Force and Home Affairs to manage the actual entry and visa requirements. In terms of how a student might apply, as I mentioned, because there's a requirement for each state and territory to be able to set their own conditions, there is going to be process variations between states and territories. So the process I'm talking about now is a broad description of what will happen, rather than being a prescriptive or precise one. So what will happen is that schools will contact their students and they will be gathering information from students and eligible guardians and aggregating that information up and providing it to local health authorities, to local education authorities, who will then be working with local health authorities to ensure that the proposed self-isolation requirements that the students have set out are in fact acceptable. Those jurisdiction by jurisdiction applications will come to the Australian Government at the Department of Education, and we'll be working with the Australian Border Force to actually look at each of those applications to ascertain whether students are indeed eligible, and the assurances they provided about where they'll be staying and their self-isolation arrangements will be appropriate such that public health requirements will be met. So once students have been assessed and have been offered an exemption by the Australian Border Force Commissioner, there's a process that will follow regarding their travel and their re-entry to Australia. As with all travellers coming in from China, they will be asked to undertake the screening that the Chinese government has arranged before they depart. We will have provided details from the Australian Border Force, via the Australian Border Force to airlines, such that students will be able to board at airports in China. And then once they've arrived at the Australian border, they'll be subject to the regular health and biosecurity screening that applies there. They'll be able to travel on from their point of entry to their destination, because we understand that not all students will necessarily be studying or staying where they arrive, but they'll be able to travel on as long as masks are worn. But once they arrive at their destination, they will be required to go into self-isolation in compliance with local health requirements, which will be advised to them, to go into self-isolation for the period of 14 days. And local health authorities will be monitoring that self-isolation period. So I think the really important messages that I would like to take for you to take away and to share with students is that students must only book travel once an exemption has been granted. The ABF Commissioner will alert the Department of Education as to who's received an exemption, and we'll communicate that back to students via their local, via the states and territory governments. But if a student attempts to travel without having that exemption, they will probably be denied boarding and they will be turned back at the Australian border. So it's very important that an exemption is acquired before any bookings are made. In order to facilitate uplift at the airport, we're asking students, once they have received an exemption and made bookings, to notify the department of what flights they will be using, such that we can advise the Border Force so that they will be expected and received at the border. That will, as I said, that will enable airlifts to uplift, and you'll be expected when you arrive. Students must observe self-isolation arrangements when they arrive, and not doing so could be considered a breach of the student's visa and may result in visa cancellation. So I think these are the most important messages to take away, that this is a process that's being managed across multiple jurisdictions, and it has to be carefully managed to ensure a smooth process for everyone. I think I wanted to leave you with some more sources of information, which I think my colleagues have already mentioned all of these, but you can find more information on the DESI website, that's Employment, Skills and Education. We've got some fact sheets there, which we've endeavoured to translate all of the student-facing products into Chinese. We have also obviously close linkages with colleagues in the Department of Health, Department of Home Affairs, and we've included not only the website but also the email and phone numbers there if you do need to seek more information. So I think I'll leave it at that, Rhett.
Well, thank you very much, Alison, for walking us through that very important process for those exempted Year 11 and 12 students. And I should mention also at this juncture that Alison works closely with Brooke Hardigan and Jared Ross, who are the Minister Councillor Education and Research and First Secretary Education and Research at the Australian Embassy in Beijing on developing these policies, and they will no doubt be a useful resource also going forward in regards to these matters. So we've got our first question, which is over to you, Alison, and it is, can you please describe further the process of self-isolation?
There is a website, a fact sheet on self-isolation available on the health website, which I would encourage people to look at. But broadly what it means is that the person has to stay at their place of accommodation and not go out. And so they need to arrange and make sure that food and other services they may need are available to them. And basically they need to stay in their place of self-isolation for 14 days.
And you mentioned earlier that there are jurisdictional differences in terms of the state and territory requirements, Alison.
Yes. Because this is a process that's going to be handled by each state and territory, there are going to be slight variations in procedure, and unfortunately, those haven't been settled yet. But what we expect and understand is that that broad feature of needing to stay at home and to not leave the home and to not share bathrooms if that's at all avoidable. Obviously, if there is a bathroom within the home that people are staying in, they are able to share. But if a single bathroom can be allocated to the person who is self-isolating, that is ideal. But with regard to differences in procedure, we're simply allowing the states and territories, if they have extra measures that they want to put in place, to do so. They have not advised us yet of particular things that they might like to do, but obviously, if that is the case, students in that particular jurisdiction will receive advice as to what they are.
Sure. Thank you so much. The next one we have is for Matt. And it comes from Jinyan, who says, we have received a student visa after the 1st of February 2020. However, we could not check on the visa status on Vivo. Is there something wrong?
Thanks for the question. Thanks, Rhett. Yes, there was some media reporting yesterday on some functionality issues with Vivo. So as you would be aware, Vivo is the system that essentially replicates information held in departmental systems to help visa holders comply with conditions attached to their visa. Now, we are aware of a number of student visa grants that have gone to students resident in mainland China since the travel restriction has been imposed, where Vivo functionality is an issue. So we've updated our website to reflect that and note that for some students impacted, like I said, after travel restrictions, they will get an error code with Vivo. Now, there's a number of other ways that are currently available for a student to establish their visa status. One, they have their personal IMI account, which will show all correspondence from the department. So if there's a grant notification there and there's no other evidence of any communication, a student can assume that they still have a visa valid for entry to Australia. But if they want a bit more reassurance in the sort of style that Vivo is able to do that, there is an online inquiry form linked to Vivo where a student can simply put in their passport details and their name, and they'll quickly receive an email back to confirm visa status. And there's also our global service centre where a student can make a quick call to that call centre and have verbal advice of their visa still being in effect. The article yesterday that some of you may have been aware of also went on to say that it was a bit alarmist in suggesting that Vivo was used by airlines in order to satisfy themselves that a person has a visa to Australia. Vivo is not the system that airlines use. Indeed, they have no access to it. They use the Advanced Passenger Processing system, the APP, as you would probably know it as. And this is the connectivity between our systems and an airline that gives an okay to board. And that system effectively pings back to confirm boarding, etc. Now, obviously, APP would be aware of where travel restrictions are in play, and that's where we would say, of course, that if any student knows that they are affected by the travel restriction, the clear message at this time is do not attempt to travel. I'll just extend that question out quickly, if that's okay, Rhett, just to touch on some of the cancellation activity that has taken place when people have attempted to travel during the travel restriction period. So of course that's not action that Home Affairs, Australian Border Force want to undertake. So the clear message here is if you're impacted by the travel restriction, don't attempt to travel unless you meet one of those other exceptions, of course, or indeed been outside of mainland China for that 14 days. The process that's been put in place by Australian Border Force colleagues is that if someone does attempt to board and they are impacted by the travel restriction, their visa may be cancelled. What the process is from there is that visas are being reinstated for people who can demonstrate that they've been outside of mainland China for a minimum period of 4 days, or they fall into one of those existing exemption categories. And obviously that revocation process is guided by notifications from the department. Again, there is a bit of our website that talks about this process, and there's a public-facing email address called visa.cancellations@homeaffairs.gov.au for anyone who thinks they've been impacted by a cancellation. They can seek some further guidance from that email address as to their particular circumstances. But the clear message really is obviously do not attempt to travel if you feel you're impacted by the travel restriction and you haven't met one of those exemptions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Matt. And look, we'll ensure we share that email address with all the agents who have joined today's discussion, so they have an outlet if they are aware of anyone that has been affected by those visa cancellations.
Thank you, Brett. That would be great.
So the next question that we have here, I think should probably go to Alison, which is, or Matt, I'll leave it open to both of you. While students are overseas, are they still required OSHC, which is of course their overseas student health cover? Please feel free to jump in. Alison,
can we take that one on notice?
Yeah, look, I think this is a good. Thank you for that question, because that's a good question, and it's something that we actually have asked our colleagues at the Department of Health on from a visa perspective. I suppose I can answer from a visa perspective. Under our policy and our regulatory requirements, a student must maintain that overseas health cover for the period of effect of their visa. But obviously the intent of that is for coverage whilst in Australia, because there are circumstances, of course, that we know where students return overseas for various reasons and have long deferral periods. From our perspective, we do, from a visa requirement, we would expect that health cover to cover that period. So at such a time as they're able to come in, they maintain that. They've maintained that through that period. Of course, we're dealing with extraordinary circumstances here, and I think it's probably one that, from our perspective, and Ali, I don't know if education's got a view here, but something we'd probably say it should be maintained at this point. But that is a real sort of parked issue that if the travel restriction was to go for a significantly longer period and a mode of study was online overseas, not back in Australia, and OSHC was due to expire in line with a visa, then that's something that probably ourselves, health education, will need to probably have a collective view on, given we've all got a bit of a stake in the intent behind a student having the OSHC.
Yes, look, I'd echo that. I think it's important that whilst there's a prospect of the student travelling and being in Australia, obviously it's important that health coverage be in place. But I agree that there's some work that we can do in order to provide some further clarity on that, and happy to be part of that conversation.
Thank you very much to both of you. We'll take that one away on notice, and again, we'll share with you all a response on that going forward, because I think, as was mentioned by Matt, it's an extremely good and important question. So the next one, I believe, is for you, Matt, which is from Gloria, who asks, we have a student whose passport was issued in Wuhan in Hubei province. However, they are now living in Zhengzhou in Henan. Can they still enter Australia if they go to a third country for 14 days?
I think you know, under the travel restriction as it stands at the moment, the answer would be yes, but I think, you know, there would probably need to be a decision about how recent that activity in Wuhan was, and that's probably a sort of a more local consideration. But I think, Ali, in terms of the recent exemptions that have been announced, I think there's still an element of Hubei province to that exemption.
Yeah, look, I can comment with regard to the waiver process. We're saying that students who've been in Hubei in the last 14 days could not travel to Australia. So just echoing what you said, it really matters when they were in the province.
Terrific, thank you very much. The next question, again for you, Matt, is from Nina Lee in Hong Kong, who says, will Hong Kong students be affected since their nationality is Chinese, including in relation to the processing and granting of visas?
In short, no, if they haven't been residing or indeed transiting through mainland China, so not including Hong Kong, since the 1st of February, or indeed in the last 14 days.
Okay, thank you. And then the next one for you, Alison, is from Taiwan, which is, in Taiwan, students are relatively in a more safer place than students from China. Do Taiwanese students also need to self-isolate?
It really boils down to whether they have transited through Hubei or mainland China, or if they've had exposure to someone who has been affected by coronavirus, by COVID-19. But generally speaking, echoing Matt's advice about travelling from Hong Kong, no, there's not a restriction on people travelling from Taiwan.
That's correct. If I can just add to that, Alison, I understand different states and territories in terms of their government school bodies have different in respect to advice for self-isolation, but we continue to emphasise to them that Hong Kong and Taiwan should be excluded in regards to that self-isolation in line with the Commonwealth Medical Office's advice. But different states and territories do have different requirements, so please refer to your provider or your state and territory that is your study destination for advice in that regard, I think. The next question is in regards to 600 visa applications, Matt. So this one's for you. Yep. Dear officer, are 600 visa applications from China being processed as normal? We have not received a 600 visa application result for over 1 month.
Yeah, there has been a suspension on other temporary visa products. So the 600 visa that's being referred to there is a tourist visa. So there has been a suspension on the approval of those visas. Processing continues, but that suspension stands. We, of course, from a student perspective, noting that students have, a great incentive to return as soon as they can, and indeed, have been using other pathways to get to Australia, have been able to take the decision to continue to process and approve student visas, knowing that there's students with a lot of responsibilities back in Australia, or indeed very keen to start their education journey in Australia. So certainly from a student perspective, I'm very pleased that the processing continues, but there has been a requirement to suspend other visa processing from residents in mainland China due to travel restrictions.
Okay, thank you, Matt. And a follow-up question on that. So if students' parents already hold a 600 visa and they go to a third country for 14 together with the student, after 14 days, can they enter Australia with the student?
Yes.
Excellent. So the next one goes to Alison, and it is a question with regard to the visa conditions when it comes to undertaking online courses. The question is, would the participation in lengthy online courses deemed to be a breach of the student's visa condition?
I wouldn't like to speak to whether it's a breach of their visa conditions. Matthew, did you want to, or did you have a view on that issue? Certainly the government is taking, oh, sorry.
I'll go on.
To speak over you. I just wanted to say that the government's taking a very flexible and student-centred approach to the situation, and all of the regulators have made clear to providers, and we'd like to make it clear to students as well, that we are looking to provide every amount of flexibility that we can, and we are certainly not looking to penalise providers or students where, in the circumstances, study is being offered online. But I didn't want to speak necessarily to the visa issue directly, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. And I would just absolutely support and echo Ali's comments on that. Of course, whatever providers can do to support students through this process and online learning is a big part of that. So absolutely supported by Home Affairs. We were really pleased to see the regulators and Ali and her colleagues early on in the piece support that, and we of course do. I would also just make the point that the general mode of study is guided by regulators working with providers, etc. So for Home Affairs technically to have an issue anyhow, we need to be alerted to that issue by a provider through a breach of visa condition. So both we don't have a problem with it, we absolutely support it, and assuming providers of course do, and yourselves as education agents and the student, I can pretty much say that we're very joined up on there being no action taken in that space.
Terrific, thank you. So this next one is for Alison, and it is once a year 11 and 12 students submit their application to return to Australia under the exemption, when will they know the result?
All right. Now, the first thing I'd like to say is that because we haven't got all of our states and territories opting in yet, we haven't been able to receive any applications. And I'd also like to stress that this is a new process for us, so I don't want to give a commitment to a particular timeline. However, we appreciate that people want a response as soon as is possible, and we are hoping and working toward probably a 4 working day turnaround on responses, but that assumes that everything about the application is present and correct, and that all of the various parties that actually need to look at it, remembering that once the student supplies that information to a school, it then goes to a local education authority, to a local health authority, before coming to the Commonwealth and then going to the Border Force Commissioner. I just want to be really clear that there's a lot of parties involved in making this work, and that we're all working together as closely as possible. But as I said, our ideal is 4 working days to enable all of that to happen, but we are not making a commitment to that time frame. Obviously, as we handle more of these applications, all of the parties involved are going to get better at doing it, and we will look to speeding that process up.
Thank you very much. This one then for you, Matt. If a student has stayed in Thailand for the last 14 days, and then they fly to Australia via Hong Kong International Airport, are they still permitted entry?
Yes.
Excellent. This next one should be for you, Matt. So from Jia Sun, a student has finished a bachelor study in Australia and plans to continue master study in February. Her current student visa expires on March the 16th, and she has lodged a new student visa, but the health examination has not yet been finalised. Can she enter Australia on March the 13th if she has left mainland China for 14 days?
That is a good question. So if I understand the question correctly, so her current visa would expire actually probably on the 15th of March. That's a standard sort of visa expiry date. She's lodged a new student visa that has not been finalised, and probably referencing back to what I said earlier, that we're aware of some localised issues around meeting some of the mandatory criteria such as health, but she has a short period of entry there and wants to come in on the 13th of March. Been outside mainland China so for 14 days, so tick from a travel restriction perspective. So she'd have 2 days left of the validity, and then should be able to pick up the application here. The problem I would see with that potentially is that the person would not to get too visa technical here, but the person wouldn't have a bridging visa in association with the outstanding application, because you only get a bridging visa in association with a visa lodged on shore. So if that person were to do do that, what they would have to do is very quickly resolve a bridging visa for themselves in association with the application of overseas. So my actual conservative advice here would be to await the finalisation of the visa application overseas, because I'd just be concerned about a very tight time frame around the expiry of the current visa and the person's ability to regularise their status in Australia. And also, of course, I can't speak for Australian Border Force, but anyone arriving with such a small amount of validity on the visa with no sort of lawful pathway on crossing that border that goes beyond a day or two, you know, slightly problematic. So I think the conservative approach would be do everything you can to meet all the criteria, get the visa and come in at such a time that you've met the travel restriction and you have the new visa. That would be the best approach.
Thanks, Matt. That's terrific. Thank you for that clarification. So the next one is also for you, and it relates to the post-study work rights visa, the 485 visa, and it is if a postgraduate student takes a whole semester course online, i.e. they do all their subjects online for one semester, will the online supported course affect the student's eligibility to apply for a post-study work rights visa?
Yeah, great question, and one that we've actually got to progress in terms of providing a bit more advice on. So can't give anything definitive on that, but very aware of that issue and working with other colleagues responsible for that visa product and the thinking there. I'll go back to, I suppose, whilst this is not a binding comment, but just back to my earlier comment around what we're trying to do here is really have a guiding principle that no student should be adversely impacted by travel restrictions, whether that's in a current setting or indeed eligibility for future visa pathways that they may have ordinarily, you know, obviously been able to tick off in a normal mode of study, etc. So if you don't mind, Rhett, and the person who asked that very good question, I might say that we'll take that one on board and advise that we will have more to say on that, and I'm sure, given the interest there, that would form part of our update in our student FAQs on the Home Affairs website.
Terrific, thank you, Matt. Next one, I apologise again for you, from Frank 1, which is if a student passport is issued in Hubei, but they have not lived in Hubei for the last 6 months, can they go to Australia? Do they need to provide any evidence to prove that they have not lived in Hubei for the last 6 months? And how do they prove this?
Yeah, look, I think on these questions, I'd just go back to the Australian government travel restriction advice around not being in mainland China for that last 14-day period. So you know, from a border entry perspective in Australia, it shouldn't be an issue, but obviously there may be more considerations locally that need to be taken into account there.
Well, thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've only got 3 minutes to go, and what I might do to close off is just offer both Matt and Alison the chance to quickly say some final few words to you all for anything that they'd like you to focus on. And then we'll close off today's session, which I think you'll all agree has been extremely valuable. So I might turn to Matt first for some closing remarks.
Thanks very much, Rhett, and just a big thank you for the opportunity to speak to so many education agents in China. And again, I hope you're all keeping well, and thank you for the job that you do for international students, both now and in the future. I'll just really finish with a comment around the numbers that we're seeing of Chinese people resident in mainland China still applying for student visas, which is great to see. We remain well resourced here in Australia to deal with those applications, and indeed hopefully they'll flow back to levels that we've seen historically. China is an incredibly important market, obviously very important to government, but all it does in terms of the international education sector. It's got a very high grant rate, as you would know, so well into the high 90% in terms of a visa assessment process. So again, for the part that you play there, thank you. We see high quality visa applications, and I'm sure, as Ali and others and Rhett would say, that continues on with a great quality of education, and certainly enriching Australia broadly with their presence here. So I would just say in closing, thank you very much, and please engage with providers who engage with peak bodies, etc., to receive any up-to-date messaging from Home Affairs. Stay tuned on the website for any updates as we can, and I hope to engage with you all on any future webinars. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Matt, and now we'll turn it over to Alison.
Thank you, Rhett, and thank you all. Just echoing Matt's comments there. Thank you for taking the time to take part in the webinar today. It is indeed a privilege, but incredibly helpful to be able to talk with so many of you at one time to talk about these important measures. Just one last mention from me that please ensure that none of the students that you're working with seeks to travel without an exemption in place if they do think they meet the 11-12 criteria, to wait until you have an exemption, and to ensure that your travel proceeds smoothly. We look very much forward to welcoming students back from mainland China as soon as we can. We've certainly missed having them on our campuses and having you in our cities. So it's certainly something we look forward to working with you on welcoming those students back again. And thank you again for your time, and thanks to Austrade for setting up the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Alison. And I'm sure on behalf of all our viewers, they would like me to express their thanks to both of you for taking the time this afternoon to provide what has been, I think, an incredibly insightful couple of presentations, as well as answers to their important questions. So thank you so much. So ladies and gentlemen, that draws our webinar today to a close. So we will be happy to circulate to you some of the responses to those questions on notice, together with the presentations from today's webinar, and we look forward to engaging with you going further with this particular process. So please pay attention to the government Weibo and WeChat channels for further information as it comes to hand, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thank you.